Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our World Green Building Week webinar. Thank you for those of you who have joined us promptly. We will make a start in a minute or two. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get started, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the World Green Building Council's webinar on social value and equity in the built environment. It's a pleasure to have so many of you with us today from locations all around the world, whether you're joining us this afternoon live or watching the recording. My name is Katrina Brady. I'm the Director of Strategy and Development at the World Green Building Council, and I have the pleasure of being your host for today's session. So if you will allow me to begin with a very brief introduction to the World Green Building Council. We are a global action network dedicated to sustainability in the built environment. We work to transform the building and construction sectors across three thematic areas: climate action, health, well-being and social value, and resource efficiency and the circular economy. And we work with the 70 national member councils, the green building councils all around the world, and their 35,000 members to help to try and trigger a more sustainable built environment for everyone, everywhere. And speaking of everyone, you can see on screen that the theme for this week's campaign week, this week is our World Green Building Week, and the theme is building for everyone. So obviously our conversation today about equity, about justice, social value is absolutely right on point for our theme of this entire week. So please do join the conversation with the hashtags building for everyone or hashtag WGBW 2022. Today's session is hosted by our global program, Better Places for People, which is our program focused on health, well-being and social equity in the built environment. And may I begin by thanking our program partners, Saint-Gobain, Multi-Green, Bureau Happold, Shaw Contract and Multiplex for their support with this work, which is active through the Green Building Councils in over 30 countries worldwide. So as we progress towards the topic of today's webinar, I'd really like to frame the conversation before we dive into further discussions in the context of our health and well-being framework. Published in 2020, the principles of our health and well-being framework underpin the work of the Better Places for People program that I just introduced. In case you haven't seen it already, the health and well-being framework is a high-level educational resource that's structured across 6 core principles for health in its broadest sense across the built environment. And I mean, when I say broad sense, it really does encompass the entire value chain. It goes from indoor environmental quality through to nature-based solutions, user behaviors, human rights and social value in the supply chain, adaptation, resilience and mitigation of climate change from a health perspective. So there's a huge amount in there. And today we're just going to be focusing on the content of Principle 5, which we'll get to in a second. But for more information about any of that, please do have a look at the World GBC's Health and Wellbeing Framework pages. You can see the link on the bottom of the screen, I hope, and there are a huge amount of resources available there to help you get involved and use it on your projects or strategy or work that you are doing in this space. So let's start to focus down on just the focal area of today's session. We're looking at social value and equity, which still in itself is a huge topic. But a small word of background from me, first of all, to frame the conversation and give a few facts for those of you who are less familiar with the topic so far. Firstly, of course, we know that the built environment affects both our physical and mental health. Our lives are shaped by the communities and cities that we live in, and on average, we spend 90% of our time inside buildings, and that was a statistic taken even before the pandemic. So I suspect in recent years that number has been far higher. Social value and equity in the built environment is a topic, though, that presents challenges across all stages of the supply chain, all stages of the building and construction life cycle. And for example, forced labor and human trafficking is an estimated $150 billion industry, holding 25 million people in modern slavery worldwide. Obviously, this is across all sectors, but it is well known that building and construction is a sector which retains some utilization of forced or child labor or modern slavery. Looking further down the supply chain, we know that physical and mental health of construction workers is another huge issue. It accounts for over 40% of occupational cancer deaths and registration. So obviously a very substantial issue. Now, the built environment, as we know, it shapes our lives massively. So it has the opportunity to enhance social value in many ways through the assets that we live, that we work in, that are in operation, and throughout the life cycle as well. And this is the scope that we have equipped our panelists with today to discuss. We know that the provision of social value can enhance the desirability of a project and aligns with corporate social responsibility targets, with ESG criteria, and are increasingly being expected in developed markets. Providing and enhancing social value, therefore, is obviously the right thing to do, but it strengthens the business case as well. There's growing expectation that companies respect human rights as set out in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines. So there are three scales at which we're going to be looking at today that are framed within our health and well-being framework, that through the built environment, we should be able to enhance and protect social value in people's lives. And those are building, community, and supply chain. And we'll be hearing much more about each of those areas a little later today. And so with that, I'd like to move us on to our opening remarks. I'd like to invite Annabelle Short, a great friend of our program, to provide some opening remarks to frame this topic in more detail. Annabelle has 2 decades of experience advancing greater respect for human rights and climate action by business in many regions. She's currently a senior advisor in the built environment to the Institute of Human Rights and Business, and is author of the report Dignity by Design: Human Rights in the Built Environment Lifecycle. In addition to her international human rights work, Annabelle has worked at the local level in New York City on coalition building for city and state level policy changes that benefit the climate, workers, and communities. Annabelle, thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to hand over the mic to you to share some opening remarks on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina, and welcome everyone. And I think I just want to start off by saying how thrilled I am at multiple signals of change that we're seeing at the moment in terms of growing attention, both on the sustainability side of buildings, but also on the social and human rights dimensions as well. I'm going to share just 3 alternative scenarios to give a sense of what are we talking about when we're talking about human rights and social equity in the built environment. And then I'll share just a few leverage points or examples of ways to take this agenda forward from my perspective. So first, if we think about the materials supply chain, which everyone in the industry is fully aware is deeply complex, involves multiple materials to put together a single building. So you could either imagine a scenario that's going to continue involving heavy extraction of sand to go into cement, which has not only the environmental implications, but also social in terms of erosion of rivers that communities depend on, even up to sand mafias in certain contexts. And then the labor rights issues that Katrina highlighted that take place in multiple building materials supply chains. Or there are opportunities to take a path, for example, like Mass Design did with the design of a hospital in Rwanda, when they recognized that local volcanic rock was actually being a hindrance to local farming activities and was just sitting there not being used, and developed a whole industry of local artisans using that rock in order to build the hospital, which has then developed multiple local businesses which have continued to thrive even beyond the construction of the hospital itself. And it's interesting to see on the materials side that certain countries in their just transition plans, thinking about coal producing regions and areas that are moving from heavy industry, have highlighted the local production of sustainable building materials as one way in which to generate new and thriving economies in those regions. Second area I would hone in on is the structural safety of buildings. And in many ways, building codes is something that I think is embedded in everybody's mind. And the social dimensions of structural safety, such a fundamental part of the building process, aren't always taken into account. But there are very clear examples when that can cause cost to lives. The Grenfell fire in the UK, the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, when workers were highlighting the cracks that were appearing in the building, but their concerns were ignored and leading to the tragic loss of several of those garment workers' lives. On the other hand, actually really investing in the integrity of buildings, on the quality of buildings, and on maintaining old buildings can be utterly transformative. One example is the region of New Delhi in India recently investing significantly in upgrading the whole of the region's school buildings. And there was a story of a 12th grader who used to skip school multiple times. The tin roofs were unbearably hot through many months of the year. The smells of the bathrooms would reach across the whole school building. There's just very little incentive to be there and to study and to thrive. After these major improvements were made with government funding and with private sector companies engaged in renovating and upgrading the buildings, he now says, I come to school because I know that I can become something. And actually, I would share a similar story in terms of my husband working in a community college here in the United States, and similarly just really drives home like how transformative it would be if that whole area in the building and classrooms where students are studying were places that people really want to go and be. And then thirdly, I would highlight access to adequate housing, which in all parts of the world is one of the major pressing issues at the moment that's driving deepening inequality and is first and foremost, along with the climate crisis, in people's minds. We could project a future when we have increasing investment into new builds, often on shorelines, often that remain empty, that drive up local housing costs, or conversely, really invest in the housing that people need and expanding access to the buildings that do already exist. A report that's going to be coming out soon, for example, by the Building and Woodworkers Union, has some really beautiful examples of building and construction workers working in partnership with local authorities and with industry in terms of expanding access to housing, whether it's Sewa women construction workers in India who are installing ceiling lights to allow more light to come into the rooms, which enables greater homework and less dependence on unreliable energy grids, whether it's a major policy platform in New Zealand to put forward an agenda for a new way of building that expands housing and that also invests in local construction materials. So I think wherever you're sitting around the built environment life cycle, it's easy to imagine ways in which we can be moving forward in ways that continue to deepen inequality and undermine human rights, or alternative paths forward. I'd like to flag, as Katrina touched on at the beginning, many of those issues that I've covered, whether it's physical and mental health, housing, workers' rights, education, are already internationally recognized human rights standards. So when we think about national and local governments' duty to protect human rights, and when we think about the private sector's recognized responsibility to respect human rights, taking action on social equity and human rights in the built environment is actually just a way of adhering to existing expectations and to really put them into practice and live up to them. Secondly, as Katrina mentioned, there are opportunities to generate real value in getting this right. On social value, a key point that I always like to raise is first and foremost connecting with value that it already exists in a particular location and being sure that any new project or new development or new change is first thinking about what's the value to people who are already living in this vicinity and how can that be protected, nurtured, and carried forward. Thirdly, no one actor can tackle these issues alone. However, through our work, we really emphasize that everyone has particular leverage points that they can harness, whether that's through regulation, procurement decisions, contracts, subcontracts, policy advocacy. And on the policy advocacy side, I would lift up, how powerful it is when groups of enlightened private sector actors, investors, and others come forward to try and move bold action for a more socially equitable built environment. At the same time, it's important for people to be thinking about how their sides of their businesses which engage in policy making and engaging governments are not lobbying against the future that we want to see. And I think that kind of corporate engagement of governments is a key nexus point where a lot of change is needed. And my final point is slowing down, and the earlier the better. It came through really powerfully in a recent session that we held, that actually looking across the whole life cycle of a project from its very earliest stages and investing the time up front to assess what might be the risks to people throughout the project's life cycle and what are the multiple different opportunities of doing this better, not only makes sense from a human rights perspective, but actually can lead to a much more sustainable project in the long term in terms of reduced opposition to the project, in terms of labor stoppages, in terms of harnessing benefits locally, but then also in the wider region as well. And the work that together with many partners we're working on at the moment is to really drive up an understanding of how to track, measure, monitor those wider social risks and social impacts from the very earliest stages of projects as well. So I will leave it there. Look forward to very much to hearing from the other panelists, and thank you again for inviting me on to this session.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. That was an incredibly rich set of opening remarks for us. And if I may, I will just ask you a quick question, because we have a comment in here from Sarah, which is actually something that I had noted down myself to ask you in the panel. But Sarah, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, has commented that transforming the way we build ahead of COP27, bringing the right to housing, labour rights, participation and spatial justice up front in climate action for buildings and infrastructure, I suppose, is obviously a priority. And I want to think back to how you began your remarks, where you said this is an interesting time that people are increasing in awareness about these topics. To what extent do you think that COP27 being in Africa, the Egyptian government highlighting the issues of resilience and adaptation and equity is part of that? How much can we thank COP for that?
I wouldn't say it's thank COP, it's thank the people who've been advocating for this, from the grassroots to the boardrooms, from within government, from cities, for a long, long time. So the sort of overall COP process. But I absolutely think that there's, as you harnessed COP, I do think there's a bit of a tipping point happening. I think things like the Club of Rome's report that's just about to come out or has come out, which is an update to the limits to growth, is just one example of many ways where people are recognizing that the way that economies are developing is extremely harmful, yes, to the planet, but actually also inequality, and that it's not a question of let's think about climate action here and social over here, but actually kind of transforming business models to reduce inequality and improve human rights itself reduces impacts on the climate. So almost flipping the conversation. And I think the perspectives that are going to come through at COP, around COP, in the context of COP this year are going to be really powerful in that regard. We'll certainly be doing that, and have people on the ground there, and anyone else who wants to join with us on those endeavors very much welcome it.
Absolutely. Well, we'll be there with you and championing the message as well. Thank you, Annabelle. Okay, so let's take these remarks that Annabelle has set us off thinking about and discuss it with a panel of experts. I'm really excited about this panel because it's not often that we have not only a panel of industry experts, but also individuals who we know are experts in different stages of the value chain. So we're really going to dive into these issues of equity, of social justice, of value, from the construction process to material supply chain to health of occupants. And we've got plenty of time and knowledge amongst us to dive into these topics in detail. So let me begin by introducing our panel. First of all, may I introduce David Thompson, who is an experienced commercial real estate professional with a focus on sustainability and well-being in the built environment. David has a multidisciplinary background with experience in development, facility and property management, and asset management as well. He holds an MSc in Environmental Design and Engineering from UCL's Bartlett School of Environment, Energy and Resources in London. He holds professional credentials from the International Well Building Institute, the US Green Building Council, the Centre for Active Design, and the Green Building Initiative as well. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Katrina.
Next, allow me to introduce Maria Cashafera. Maria is the head of sustainability at Multiplex with over 10 years experience driving sustainability within the built environment in the UK and abroad. In her current role, Maria is responsible for all aspects of environmental and social sustainability, including delivery of the 2030 strategies, One Decade to Act, Multiplex's roadmap to decarbonisation, and Leave No One Behind, their social equity strategy. Maria is also a member of the World Green Building Council's Corporate Advisory Board. So thank you, Maria, for joining us today.
Thank you for the introduction, Katrina. Pleasure to join the panel.
Thank you. And last but not least, allow me to welcome Timo Marquez, who works as Sustainability Marketing Manager within Saint-Gobain's Sustainable Development Business Team. He supports Saint-Gobain's global businesses to develop a more sustainable offer and solutions on 3 pillars: carbon and energy, circularity and resources, and health and well-being. The team engages Saint-Gobain's international community to share their expertise and best practices, develop new offers, and advocate for more sustainable markets. Prior to his time at Saint-Gobain, Timo worked on green building projects and studies in Chile, France, South Africa, and Venezuela on issues related to affordable housing, energy efficiency, indoor comfort, and well-being. So thank you, Timo, for joining us.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Katrina. I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. Well, we are going to hear very shortly from David, Maria, and Timo, and we've asked them to come together, first of all, to let us be the fly on the wall for their conversation, to talk about the areas of social equity they're prioritizing in their organizations. These guys have done fantastic work and have demonstrated fantastic leadership in this space, and it's something that we can all learn from. So please feel free to pose questions to the panel, and I'll let them have uninterrupted conversation for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'll be popping back in to ask them some of your questions. So without any further ado, I'll hand over the mic now to give you all the freedom to have a full conversation. And David, I'll let you take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrina. And, thank you, Annabelle, for, such a wonderful overview of how complex and multifaceted this challenge can be in the built environment. And I love how you pointed out that it affects each part of the building life cycle. At Multigreen, we're focused on building multifamily communities, ground up construction, but we also own and operate that. So we get to see a little bit of each of the building life cycles and see how these social equity challenges affect each part of the building life cycle. And I think it would be helpful to kind of start putting this into context and how do we address each of these problems throughout these different phases. And one that Annabelle mentioned is just the accessibility of adequate housing for families. One of the major challenges that we address at Multigreen is income inequality and affordability of housing. which all over the world, but especially in the US, has a disproportional impact on minority families. I want to make a distinction because there is a specific connotation with the word, affordable housing, especially in the US. That tends to mean a specific area median income, and there's government assistance, but really what I'm talking about is more of a collective term, which we call attainable housing, which is everything up to market rate housing, because there's such a middle sector too that kind of gets left out of the conversation. And affordability of housing really spans more of a population than I think is realized. And so attainable is a little bit more encompassing of those terms. But in the US, I think that leads from this housing shortage that we're experiencing right now. Latest figures put that number at about 6.8 million homes, and the prices of those homes are up, 20% over the last year, which is the highest jump in 30 years of record keeping. So the inaffordability of homes really leads to a lot of problems in our industry, especially homes that at an attainable price point. I think last year we gained about maybe 50,000 affordable units, but we lost 125,000. That's to those inadequacies and demolition. But that problem really is highlighted and identified because of what's called a housing cost burden. So right now, there's about 25% of families in the US that are spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And about a quarter of those are spending up to like 50% of their income. So it doesn't leave a lot of disposable income for education or for food or for utilities. And that can really become a problem. When we're trying to address these issues, we also run into a challenge that we call NIMBYism, which, if you're not familiar, is an acronym for not in my backyard, right? So it's easy to have the conversation, right? Everybody kind of seems on board with, yes, we want to help people. Yes, we want to increase affordable housing, but don't do it in my neighborhood. Let's do it somewhere else. And that's a real problem when we're trying to, get properties zoned and entitlement changes, because real estate just has such a local nature, right? It's solving a problem in a hyper local region, but it still experiences, common global challenges. One of the other challenges that we look at, and because I have a kind of a building engineering background, I'm totally guilty of this, but it's really easy in the built environment to focus on the building, right? Like, what is the building energy consumption? What's the embodied carbon of our concrete and steel? And these things are really important, but we kind of miss the bigger picture, which is to focus on the people, right? Somebody smarter than me once said that, buildings need to have dysfunction, right? They're created to serve a purpose. They're not just an excuse to pour concrete. So when we start focusing on the people that are involved in the building process, then we can start to address these problems, I think, more effectively. We start, connecting the dots of social value and human equity to the structures that we're actually building, thinking about the occupants earlier on, thinking about the supply chain. As we mentioned, there's people that are impacted throughout the entire building life cycle, and especially during construction and supply chain, which we do experience. But Maria and Timo are way more experienced than I am in this field. So I wanted to kind of kick it over to Maria and just kind of see like what challenges are you facing specifically at Multiplex, and kind of how does social value and equity really impact your phases of the building life cycle that you focus on?
Yeah, thank you, David. I will say as well that the same challenges are in the UK in terms where I'm based, in terms of affordable housing and access to housing. So it's not just a local issue, but probably a global issue. For those of you who are not familiar with Multiplex, we are a global construction company. We started in Australia 60 years ago, where we are still operating the UK, the Middle East, and Canada. I'm currently based in London, but I've been lucky enough to be working in the other regions as well. I think one of the key things for us is people are at the heart of the built environment. So people bring buildings to life, constructing them, then we end up using them. In Europe, construction is ranked as the second industry most at risk of modern slavery. There is also in the UK one of the largest sectors. So it employs, I think, more than 3 million people, which represent around 8% of the overall UK workforce. As one of the largest industries in the UK, we have massive scope to lead the way and implement the changes that are needed to contribute towards reducing inequality, building more inclusive societies, and contributing to a new model of economic growth. For us, labor is essential for construction. However, and I don't know if people are familiar with this, but we have challenges like fragmented supply chains. We employ subcontractors, who deal with agencies who bring the people to our sites. There are very complex procurement processes for people to end up working on our sites and get awarded projects. And there is also a high demand for migrant labor in the industry. So all these conditions make it like a perfect environment for exploitation, which is something that we are trying to address. As a global business, though, we've been facing different challenges in different regions, but we took massive lessons learned from the Middle East, where probably is a very different environment from compared to the UK. So what we've done is, with the team on the ground in the Middle East, we launched an ethical labor management system. So similar to what you were saying earlier about people talking about embodied carbon, energy efficiency, etc. Everybody talks about the environmental management system being 14,001 certified, etc. We've just created the same, but to address ethical labor. So with that there, we started talking, investigating where people were coming from. So in that particular scenario from the Middle East, lots of people were being recruited from Nepal. So like, how does that process work, etc. All those things that we learned in the Middle East are applicable to our other regions. So in the UK now, in 2019, we launched our ethical labor management system that to do exactly the same process. It's like questioning everything that happens within our supply chain. And we do audits, exactly the same as for the other management systems. So we have an audit regime that focuses on wages. So how much do people get paid? Do they get paid the minimum wage for the UK, the national one, or London, Scotland, wherever they are based? Visibility of labor churn. Why are people leaving our sites? Where did they come from? Where are the agencies? And we cover all this under an umbrella of our ethical labor principles. So they address working conditions, living conditions, mobility, working representation, employment standards, fairness, respect, integrity, etc. As a business, we are committed to ensuring that everyone is treated fairly. Everything is, of course, legal, but there is a decent treatment of the workers by meeting all the employment standards. Katrina mentioned during the introduction our 2030 strategy. So in 2021, we launched One Decade to Act, which is our decarbonization roadmap. But as we say, we cannot look at the two things separately. So we also launched our social equity strategy, Leave No One Behind. But I think I'll stop there and I'll allow Timo to share his point of view before I give you more information on that one.
Perfect. I share all your comments, and indeed, with the introduction of at the beginning, there are many things we can talk about also from Saint-Gobain's point of view. As you know, Saint-Gobain, 80% of our activities related to the construction sectors, from windows, plaster insulation, coating, etc., and many other things that are quite vast. We're in over 70 countries around the world, more than 150,000 people employed. So we have locations everywhere. And as the topic of today, social equity, we address and are affected by different cultural contexts, economic and political situations, and also education related to how to construct and build better for the comfort, not only of the person living there, but also, as Maria was mentioning before, the worker. On that regards, we have worked for many years on these different topics on well-being, circularity, energy. And something that I would like to share in 2021, we updated or we recreated something that we call the sustainability guidelines by Saint-Gobain, which tries to narrow down or simplify this complexity, not only of the value chain of our customers. We're also close to extraction centers, And this simplification addresses, we have 4 pillars. One of these better for the planet, better for the people, better economic value, and better quality. And you can see that each of these pillars is going to address different people in different communities that we work on. And when we talk about better for the people, we address not only the user in terms of thermal, acoustic, daylighting, indoor pollution comfort, but also the job site. Are products easy to install? Are they composed with materials that are known polluting when the actual worker is putting it into place? So these are some of the things that we look at from the site, from the manufacturing site, down to the different clients that we may have. And we have a wide spectrum of clients, from construction companies to architects and engineers that are going to be prescribing our products, down to the do-it-yourself person that's going to be purchasing on the retail scenario the products to install them in the house. So we have to approach all of them in a different way to make sure that the activities that they're doing also respect different areas in terms of human rights, well-being, and other things that bring the interesting part of the complexity towards the topic of sustainability. So those are the things that we're working on. And then to finalize this topic, and it was something interesting that was mentioned at the beginning related to resources. We think mainly when we talk about social equity, sometimes affordable housing or the segments of the population on that end of the value chain. And the resource part is quite important when we talk about extraction of materials. So what do we put in place to make sure that procurement is done in the most optimal ways in terms of, the contract we're putting into place, from who we're purchasing? Do we have a transparency in terms of the products that are we putting into the products? So those are also things that are at our core of activities. I don't know if there's only other topic, David, that you think it would be interesting to pick on our brains.
There's so much to unpack there. Both of you just provide some excellent insight, and I want to start with you, Timo, just since you just mentioned about resources. At I think COP15 was when there was originally $100 billion a year that was pledged toward these climate initiatives around the world. Whether that really materialized or not is still an ongoing topic of debate, and was brought up at COP26 in Glasgow this last year. But how do we ensure that the resources that are being provided are being distributed in the right way? How are we applying those resources, to projects that would be both locally relevant to address some of these challenges that we just identified, and then also have a global significance, right, towards greater change and improvement in social value and equity in the built environment?
A good question. I'm going to try to pick a portion of that question. But when you talk about resources, I would start with the human resource that we have internally, in terms of how to mobilize our teams to make sure that we have the impact that we would like. And I have a couple of interesting examples on that. When we talk about access to construction materials, because we're probably giving, we're assuming that is you just go to the shop and you buy it. But sometimes the pricing is not the adequate for the population or the segment that needs to rebuild or to construct a house or another building. So I think access to construction materials is interesting. And in that regards, when you look at the business models, it's something that we're starting to work on with different teams in different countries. For example, when we touch the topic of affordable housing, you have informal settlements. In those informal settlements, you have people that distribute themselves construction materials, not necessarily in a legal or juridic legal way. What do we do in those communities, in those situations, for them to have not only access to quality materials at an interesting and attainable price, as you mentioned at the beginning? That's something we're analyzing to see how can we adapt or transform that business model for not only the pricing but the quality to be available to different conditions. So our teams internally are working on that, specifically in Argentina, Brazil, and South Africa. There are some topics on that. And then probably the other part of the question in terms of material resources. We have a lot of projects going on related to circularity in terms of what do we do with glass, what do we do with insulation, what do we do with plasters, what do we do with providers in terms of how to do that. And when we talk about providers, it's like who, where they're from, what activities they're carrying out, not in terms of the material, but the people that are working in their communities. So resources have, many shades of gray, let's go like that. And it's interesting to see what each one can contribute on that front.
I will add that, David, if I can.
Yes, please.
I think Timo touched on it, but it's like people, when, particularly in the UK, I mentioned earlier the challenges that we have with needing workforce labor for our construction projects, is like giving opportunities to people. I think the construction industry is traditionally a male-dominated environment, long hours, different challenges for the workforce who may be facing like 14-hour-long plus commute, etc. And there is a shortage of people who actually want to get involved. So it's like making it accessible for people. There is also giving opportunities to people from disadvantaged backgrounds, from ethnic minorities, people who traditionally would face difficulties to have access to those opportunities. And when I say local, I mean, it does not necessarily mean within your borough, but within your city, within your county. And the other one is local procurement. So in the UK, when a project goes through planning, there's something called Section 106 that encourages, well, sets targets for a project to achieve, let's say, 10% local spend on small, medium enterprises. However, some of those companies may face challenges to access the supply chain, for example, a big construction company like ours. So we also need to look inwards and review our processes to make sure that those smaller companies who may have less resources in terms of like people are able to like provide all the information that we require and to engage in the process. And so for us, it's also been a learning experience and taking all that feedback that we're getting. Why are you not employing why are you not working with those SMEs, etc. And the feedback we were getting is like, we can't access your supply chain because you do X, Y, Z. You ask us for X, Y, Z, which we don't have. So it's also like taking all those lessons and all those messages on board to make it accessible for others.
Yeah, that brings up a great point, and it's definitely easy to get kind of bogged down with all of the challenges of this problem, right? But since this is a World GBC webinar, we want to figure out how do we focus on solutions and how do we focus on lessons learned and providing some practical advice for those who are tuning in. And you said something that was really stood out to me earlier, was that we don't need to separate our quest for sustainability from our quest for social value, that those are not mutually exclusive, that in fact they work better when we address both of them at the same time. And coming from the owner operator side, a lot of the excuses, I would say, are kind of in what you were just talking about the visibility of our supply chains, that they're very complex and they keep going back and back and back and back. And so as kind of an end user, it's easy to say, well, I don't have the visibility, 3 or 4 stages back in my supply chain. Is the burden still on me to make sure that from, material extraction through, use and reuse, how does that burden kind of fall? Where does that burden fall within an organization to address some of these issues or take accountability for things that we perceive as maybe outside of our control, but are still directly related to our project or our construction site or our building?
It is definitely a challenge, but I think the key is transparency and collaboration. So I'll give you an example. Between April and June, all of our construction sites have been audited by a third party for ethical labor against our ethical labor management system. Without exception, across all of our sites, there was findings, different things, but there was whoever says that that doesn't happen is because they are not looking into their issues. Because we don't bring those workers to site, it's our supply chain. There is two routes that you can go there. Either you can send them a formal letter and be like with their closer to your finger, pointing at them and just asking for them to address everything, or say like, we don't have all the answers, neither do you, but let's work together and address all these. Yesterday, I was working with one of our supply chain representatives, their head of sustainability. And she was saying that as a result, they were replicating those audits in their tier 2. So it's like, that is how we start the journey. Are we there yet? No, unfortunately. It's like, and I think like, for example, something that for us is like, our materials come from like companies like Timus. It's like, we sometimes, because we also don't have the resources, we go back. We rely on the companies we were with, like we do those audits to make sure like we can trust their processes in place, which I think then Timo can tell us more about what they actually, what they do at their end, which is probably like closer to the end of this game.
I completely agree that transparency in the value chain is an issue. And I think probably one of the ways to approach them is, as Maria was talking, is just to be open, saying, you know, we don't have the solutions, we work on this together. What's on your plate, what's on my plate, and how can we make sure that the process works correctly. Then again, it's complex depending on the region and the size of the company and the structure and the maturity. That's also a thing. You know, sometimes we're not necessarily all at the same level regarding not only to local regulations, but also to engagements when we talk about decarbonization, etc. So saying, you know, we're at this level, we're going to help you, you know, let's talk together, sensibilize. So that's a topic there. I think probably an interesting example, a futuristic example would be what would be the evolutions of the EPDs, of the Environmental Product Declaration, if we integrated social components. Obviously, we do EPDs at Saint-Gobain. I think we're the largest manufacturer that has EPDs related to their products. When we look at do an EPD, we look at the whole value chain, from extraction to transportation to manufacturing to operation and maintenance to what happens to the product at the end of the life cycle. I think that, as an example, would be a nice conversation opener to say, what are we doing related to the social impact within the communities and different stakeholders throughout the value chain, in terms of resource consumption, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of transportation, who's involved, what are we doing to engage them and to help them improve their processes. I think that would be an interesting exercise to extrapolate the EPD, how we do it technically, you know, from a input output type of process to analyzing other aspects.
You know, I think that's, you mentioned how do we kind of become more transparent, and I think a lot of that is how do we measure, right? How do we measure our progress? How do we quantify our impact in this space so that we can really know where we stand and then be able to share that with stakeholders throughout the life cycle. That's one thing that we've been working on a lot at Multigreen is building out this impact measurement where we actually kind of try to tie that into a dollar amount spent on projects and really calculate sort of this impact rate of return, right? So how much impact are we getting per dollar spent on a project? And that really helps us internally both frame how we approach a project, right? So we're looking at things, regional challenges in a market that we may enter, looking at, you know, affordability, what are the needs of the region, what are the demographics of the region, but also once we get to the operations phase where we're able to measure our own progress against what our expectations were to reduce sort of our performance gap, our impact gap, if you will, looking at, you know, accessibility and how are we actually reducing housing cost burdens for residents of our properties. And that's been really helpful to have that in mind earlier on in the process, when we can still control the design of it. We can still control how we engage with the community and fight some of these challenges that I was mentioning at the beginning about NIMBYism and a reluctance to build more affordable and attainable structures. I was curious, how else do you kind of manage the measurement and just understanding of where you fall within that process? Have you found any good tips or tricks or ways to sort of quantify that impact and know, are we on the right track, or do we need to make a correction? Are we doing things the right way? Are we doing anything the right way?
I'll step in for that one, because as you were talking, it was all resonating with what we are doing. So we use, and this is not an sponsored comment, a platform called Loop, which used to be called the social profit calculator, which does exactly that. You enter the interventions that during construction, let's say, we provide graduate opportunities, local placements, working opportunities for local people, tree planting. All those things have a value for the communities, a social value attached to it. So with research that goes in the background, completed by this organization, they go, they assign a price, a return value to all those things. So it allows us to measure the impact that we do in the communities where we operate. We compare all that to that target that has been initially set, and then we see like how much value we can add. But it also adds to the challenge of being able to challenge ourselves to be able to deliver more every time. And then when you think about, let's say, a work placement, giving a job opportunity to someone, you are probably changing that person's life. So like there is actually a value that is, you would never consider the putting a pound for us value to it, but it actually has. So I think it links to one of the questions in the Q&A that I saw pop up, where someone was asking about a whole life assessment of social value, very similar to what has been done from an environmental point of view. And I think like that is a very good point, where you are doing that exercise, and I am continuing the journey, and then it carries on during the years of the building. So
I'm going to jump in here for 1 second, if I may. Thank you for this incredibly honest conversation. I think you guys are vocalizing a lot of things that people will resonate with, and it's really helpful for you to give practical advice of what is and isn't working. Maria, what you just said about companies are saying they don't have any human rights issues in the supply chain just means they aren't looking, I think is an absolute soundbite, and we'll be repeating that one in future. But anyway, I want to bring to your attention a question we have just been asked. It's addressed to David and Maria, but Timo would love your thoughts too. It says, David and Maria, you mentioned trying to measure impact by transferring generated social value into fiscal amounts. Do you think there are flaws with this approach, with quantifying social value or putting so much value internationally on this type of indicator? Why are we so caught up on measurement?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I think there's definitely a challenge in tying it into a dollar value. And what we found in our exercise in kind of establishing this measurement system is that the metrics that are really important, we might not have the right data for. But if we use that as a tool, and so we all have limited resources, right? So if we can figure out, and the whole point of quantifying it in that way is to make the most of those resources. So if we can look at two different options as we're going into a project, and we see that one has a substantially more impact on the local community or the health and well-being of our residents, that generates this kind of internal scorecard that we have, then we can direct more resources to that versus something else that may seem like it has impact, but in the grand scheme doesn't really have the impact. And so I think there's an extreme importance in measuring this in whatever we can, and the system itself is imperfect, right? We're never really going, there's so much qualifying that's required that it's hard to start quantifying that, right? It's how can you really measure, like Maria was talking about, the impact of a job on somebody's life, and then where that sends that person to the next phase, and this ripple effect of positive impact. It's almost impossible to quantify, but we try to really focus our efforts on the things that we see will have the most on, just the metrics and the KPIs that we identified are extremely relevant to our specific business and what we do in the design phase, in the construction phase, and in the operations phase.
I think I find it, to be honest, I cannot add anything to David's point. I completely agreed with everything he just said. The only thing that I would say is before, like, if we think about the construction industry, at least in the UK, like 20 years ago, health and safety, nobody would consider that everybody was like fully compliant with it. Then environmental sustainability became like the area of focus. Now nobody would question any of the interventions that happen in the projects. There's been the shift in the conversation between operational energy to like embodied carbon as well, the whole life cycle. So I would say we are now talking for a few years. We've been talking about the social side of sustainability, the S on ESG. So I think we're going through like a learning curve. So it's like what we are doing now may not be perfect, but it's a place to start. And it's like, no doubt, like we'll look back 10 years down the line and it will probably be very different, but still there will be things to be the same. So I would say it's part of the journey.
I think that's a fantastic remark. And I'm going to come to each of you now for your closing remarks. And Maria, I think you framed that beautifully by highlighting that, yes, perhaps we're still implementing the E of ESG, but it's a much more mature conversation, isn't it? In comparison to the S, there's a lot of awareness raising still that needs to be done in this space. And you guys have talked to us and given some fantastic examples of leadership, of projects that have worked, of things that haven't worked. And we've been asked genuinely existential questions by the audience as well. So thank you for everything you've shared. And if I could ask you to give us your one core takeaway that you'd like people to really remember, your one last piece of advice for people starting out on this journey, what would that be? Timo, I'll come to you first.
It's hard to resume in one or two sentences all the thoughts, so I'm going to do my best. But probably the as an end remark, it's try to simplify the message in regards to the community you're engaging. You talk about social equity. There are many stakeholders. Try to analyze who are you talking to, and you simplify what's your approach and your engagements and your objectives towards them.
Beautifully put. Thank you. Maria?
I'm going to quote something that Annabelle said at the beginning, and it's like, no one can tackle this alone. So I think collaboration across all the stages of supply chain and stakeholder engagement is key to address this.
Fantastic. And David?
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the collaboration is a huge part of our success here. But I think we have a lot of reasons to be optimistic about the direction that we're headed. The fact that Maria was just saying, a couple of years ago, nobody was talking about the S and the ESG. It was about environmental sustainability. So I think we're definitely on the right track. This topic is a difficult one to address in a lot of ways, but I think social value is really about empathy, right? It's about just understanding the importance of the changes that people are experiencing and kind of using that knowledge that we gain from these experiences to make better decisions. I also think that, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? It seems almost insurmountable at times to come up with a solution for all of these different challenges, but there's a lot of resources. And with that collaboration that Maria was talking about, we can share this knowledge and these lessons learned with each other and be open about, where our failures are and where we can do better. And I think that level of collaboration will really, advance our success in this field.
I completely agree. That's totally the purpose of bringing you here. Thank you. Annabelle, closing remarks and reflections from you?
Just a couple very briefly. First, I think maybe to mention an elephant in the room, which is financial actors. I think sort of Maria building off of no one can tackle alone. And I think a lot of the driver for quantifying and measuring outcomes comes from the way that we think about investing in the built environment. And so I would say everyone here would join in a call for a longer term perspective from finance and for ensuring that banks and private equity actors and pension funds are all a big part of this conversation as well, in terms of broadening a sense of value throughout the life cycle, longer life cycle of building projects. And then secondly, it's very clear that there are both internal and external dimensions, and it's just so great hearing from all of you three around like transformation internally. I think that's sort of where it all begins, like with colleagues around a table asking difficult questions, figuring out the ways to get things done, and then the external advocacy that any entity, company, or individual can take part in, which is part of what World GBC is facilitating and enabling, building up to COP, and then well beyond as well. So thought I would just close to, on that note around both of those fronts having enormous potential for action.
Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you very much to all of our speakers, to David, Maria, Timo, and Annabelle, and of course to all of you for joining us as well. That is all we have time for today, but in case you would like to watch any of this again, this recording will be shared alongside the other recordings of the World Green Building Week webinars that have gone on this week. You can find them on the World GBC social media channels, as well as details of our other work going on through the Better Places for People program. If you have any further questions or just would like to find out more about the World GBC programs or that of any of our partners, please do reach out via the details on screen. But for now, it's been my pleasure to host you. Thank you very much to our attendees, to our speakers, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.